In this video, I would like to talk about 3 habits of thought that can make it harder to make a game or harder to make a good game. Before I start, I would like to emphasize that none of this is a big deal. It doesn't really matter if you don't make a game. It doesn't really matter if you don't make the best possible game that you can make, and you shouldn't beat yourself up about it. This is basically a hobby. We're doing it for fun. It's fine to watch videos about making a game with the vague idea that you might make a game and never make a game. That's fine. I watch videos about tabletop role-playing games and I don't have any real desire to get back into tabletop role-playing games. I watch videos about playing a particular board game and computer game called Blood Bowl, and I don't really have any great intention of ever playing Blood Bowl again. So it's perfectly fine if you don't make a game. You shouldn't treat this as, as anything serious. But if you do want to make a game, and if you are having, problems with it, you may find that what I'm about to talk about is helpful to you. So the first habit of thought, and these aren't in any particular order, by the way, but the first one I'm going to talk about is, you might call it waiting until. So perhaps you are following along with these videos and you're thinking, well, Twine seems quite interesting. I could make a game with that one day, but I really need to find out more about how you do particular things with it. And once he gets up to that, well, I'll know enough. And once I practice enough, then I'll be able to start my game. And I would say, no, you can make a good game with Twine using no programming at all, using just text and links, and anything after that can make your game better, but it's far from necessary. You can make a game that's going to interest people using just what I've covered so far, and in fact using less than half of what I've covered so far. That's one of the good things about Twine. So if you do want to make a game, my recommendation to you, and if you are thinking, well, I'll wait until my recommendation to you would be to start now, and as you learn more things, if you find that it helps you, put those things in, but be critical. Don't put something in just because it's new and interesting. Really think about whether it's going to make your game better. And you can certainly start now, and you can certainly make a game that people are going to be potentially interested in with, less than the knowledge of Twine that I have covered so far. The second habit of thought I would like to talk about is overemphasizing either a setting or a story. And that might seem strange because what are we doing if not telling a story? Well, yes, you sort of are telling a story, but remember that you are telling a story in which the player is the hero, or at least the main character, and the interest in these games is largely about exploring the choices that you have and exploring the consequences of those choices in the game world. And that's a little bit different to exploring the world in the sense of reading about the setting, and it's a little bit different to just passively hearing a story. This is perhaps particularly true of people that are interested in fantasy and maybe science fiction as well. People tend to be very interested in their settings and spend a lot of time working out the history and the details of the setting. None of that is a story. That's just the backdrop to the story. It's partly because I think people have a misunderstanding of what makes Lord of the Rings good. They think, well, Tolkien spent years writing all of these languages and the history of all of the dwarven kings and had all this background, and isn't that what makes Lord of the Rings good? No, it's not what makes Lord of the Rings good. I think to a great extent Lord of the Rings is good in spite of the detailed backstory, not because of it. In fact, a lot of that backstory was made up after The Hobbit was written. When The Hobbit was written, there was no Mordor, there was no Gondor, there was no Harad. There wasn't really orcs. There were goblins, but they're clearly quite different. The elves in The Hobbit are clearly quite different to the elves in Lord of the Rings. The ring itself, he changed. Actually, The Hobbit, different editions of it. I mean, the current edition is the changed version, but there was a version before that where the ring was different because he hadn't sort of worked out that it was going to be the centre of this big story, and so on. So Tolkien didn't actually world build, and then when he'd finished world building, write his story. He did write languages, fake languages for fun and so on, but a lot of the world building was done after and during he was writing the story. And I think perhaps because of a misunderstanding of Tolkien, perhaps not, people who are interested in fantasy in particular tend to want to world build and world build and world build. And once they world build and world build and world build, they want to tell the reader about their world. And if you find that you're writing a whole lot of background, you say, well, it is the year such and such, and there has been a great war between the such and such and the such and such, and you are a lieutenant of these guys, and these guys are the good guys, and you've just suffered a great defeat, and you're retreating, and da-da-da-da-da, and then click next. Okay, there's more lore. If the reader is reading your background, they're not making choices, and making choices is a necessary precondition for this kind of game to be fun most of the time, I think. So I wouldn't tell you don't do world building, but I would tell you, if you have interesting bits of world building, show that to the player as something that they come across in the course of the game. Get into the choices as quickly as possible. Start with a single sentence, if you can. Now, in the example game that I'm making, I just have a single sentence. I can't remember what it is. You must cross the bridge or something. Now, obviously, the sample game that I'm making is not a full game. It's not a proper game. It's not intended to be released in the form that it is. But I think that's actually quite a sound technique. Drop the player into the action, making choices with as little introduction, as little lore as possible. And when you are thinking about your game, think about things that can happen to the main character, decisions that they might have to make, whether that be sort of moral decisions or whether that be just sort of tactical decisions. Do you fight this monster, or do you run, or do you try and negotiate with it, or do you try and use the magic item that you got from the previous, whatever. Concentrate on interesting things that are happening to the main character and interesting choices, and only investigate the background in as much as investigating the background helps you to make interesting choices. And certainly don't get into the situation of, well, I can't write my story because I haven't finished world building. No, if you're doing that, you've made a mistake. You've done too much world building. And a similar phenomenon is not so much world building, but story. Well, I have this great story, and it's about a vampire, but he's also a good person, because in my world, vampires maintain the capacity for emotion, and there's this great love story with this other character, and I want the player to experience this great story, and it will move them as much as it moves me. And no, it probably won't, because if you tell a story, if you have a preset story, which is, well, then they fall in love, and then they have to such and such and such and such, that's not giving the player choices. You can have an overall sort of mission, but the way in which the mission is carried out and the results of the mission should be up in the air. You shouldn't constrain the player. In tabletop role-playing, if you do that, you might have heard of the concept of railroading, where the DM has a particular set of things that he wants to happen, or she wants to happen, that I keep saying he because my DM was a male. But anyway, the DM has all these things that they think are going to be exciting and cool, and they're going to make the players get to those things. And if the players choose something else, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to push them into those things because those things are cool, and I want the player to see those cool things. try not to do that. I know that's hard, and I know that you get excited about particular, plot twists and situations and stuff. But again, try and remember it's about interesting choices for the player. It's not necessarily about an interesting story in the sense of a single interesting narrative which the player is going to experience whatever they do. Because if you do that, the player will think, well, why are you giving me choices that are not choices? What's the point of giving me the choice to do this when it just ends up in the same place as when I make the other so-called choice? Why don't you just write a story? Maybe a story is a better medium for you to be working in. People who play these games do say that they like the story, and they want a good story. But what story means is slightly different in a game like this, where there's choice and hopefully there's sort of more than one, outcome, and hopefully there's sort of more than one thing that can happen, as opposed to story in a novel where, of course, there is literally one story. So try and avoid having the point of the game be this interesting single story, and instead try and make it about interesting choices and the consequences of those choices. Finally, you can get excited, and this is probably the one that I'm most prone to, and that is you have an idea for a game. I'm going to make a game about a crew of people who fly a spaceship around in the future, and they are semi-criminal traders and maybe part-time smugglers and sort of guns for hire. And that's the story of the game. And then you think to yourself, and I could have a really interesting system for spaceship combat. So I'll write down that I want to have interesting system for spaceship combat. And you could make fuel really important. So you could have a really interesting system where you have to buy enough fuel to make the jump to the next star system. Okay, well, I'll write down that. And then you think of something else. Well, I could have skills. I could have every character has, chooses skills from this list of about 30. Okay, well, I'll write down, let's have skills. I could have a system for randomly generating planets, and then the type of planet could affect the price of the different goods that they could buy, or the chances of different things happening when they try and do different things. Okay, that's interesting. And all of these ideas might be really good ideas in and of themselves, but you're building up more and more stuff that you have to do before the game is finished. And remember, it is easy and fun and quick to think of stuff that could be in your game, and it is slow and difficult and actually sometimes frustrating when you can't work out what you've done wrong or can't work out how to do something. It is slow and frustrating and difficult to actually make them happen. Everything you think of that you just think, and I can do that and I'll write that down, is it's going to be at least it's another kind of week of work probably. So I would not say don't think of cool things that can be in your game, because that's a way of motivating us. That sounds really good. The vision of a good game is a way to motivate yourself to actually finish it. But instead of writing it down as this is a thing that has to be done before the game is finished, write it down and treat it as this is a thing that I could add to the game once the game is finished. In other words, think of the simplest possible finished game. All right, I'll have a game about people zipping around space in a spaceship and they're guns for hire, and people try and hire them and they get involved in crimes, or they can be merchants or something. And maybe just say, okay, well, I'll make a game about trading goods in space. All right, and once I've done that, the game is finished. And once I've done that, maybe I'll have character skills. And once I've done that, then maybe I'll have that they can get involved in crimes. And then once I've done that, maybe I'll, etc., etc. And so that way, if you do stop at any one point, if you do go, this is too much, this particular idea sounded good, but it's too hard, you won't have a half-finished game, you'll have a finished game. And that's going to motivate you to do another game and motivate you to keep going a lot more than a half-finished game. A half-finished game that might have taken as much work as the finished game. In other words, if you could take 2 months to make a finished game, well, that's going to be much better than taking 2 months and ending up with a half-finished game. So don't add things that have to be done before the game is complete. Add things that you could add to the game after the game is finished, or to say the same thing in another way, think of the simplest possible game, finish that, and then if you're still motivated, if you still like the game, and if you don't want to move on to something else, all of which is perfectly fine, another game or even just another hobby, then add more, right? Don't push back the time until the game becomes complete, because from personal experience, I know what happens. You go, I'm going to do this, 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 oh, this is just too much, I'm never going to finish this. And you give up and you don't even finish the first thing that you thought of, because you realise that what you've created for yourself is far too much, far too overwhelming, not rewarding enough for something that's meant to be a hobby and that, let's face it, you're not getting paid for, right? So I hope that's of some help. I'll summarise it again. First of all, don't beat yourself up over any of this. This is a hobby. If your hobby is making you stressed and anxious, you either need a new hobby or you need to relate to your hobby in a different way. Nothing's at stake here, okay? So don't beat yourself up. But if you are interested in finishing a game, and if you're finding that you have trouble doing that, there are some habits of thought that you might be falling into, and specifically there are 3 ideas. 1, thinking you have to wait until you learn more about the code or the language. 2, overemphasis on either telling a story or describing a setting. And that's not so much going to stop you making a game, but it'll stop your game being as good as it could be. Although it can stop you making a game, because you can get so into world building that you end up building a detailed world and you don't have a game. And the 3rd habit is adding goals, adding features that have to be finished before the game is finished. So it's good to think of more ideas for features, but treat them as things that you're going to do once the game is finished, not things that have to be done for the game to be finished. So I hope that was helpful to some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.